everybody. It's lovely to see so many people here. My name is Asper Baroutzis, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Education at Southern Cross University. And I would like to acknowledge the lands upon which we work, live, and study, and acknowledge that they always were and always will be Aboriginal land. This is the first session in our Dean's Keynote series, and the title of the series is called Dissecting Influence, Critical Insights into Education and Education Research. And so we're interested in this idea of influence and within education, and particularly education policy. Who does the influencing and who are they attempting to influence? And I will pass over to the Executive Dean of the faculty, Professor Amy Cutter-Mackenzie-Knowles, who will introduce the speakers.
I am very honoured to introduce our speakers today. So, Jill, Professor or Distinguished Professor Jill Blackmore, as well as Julie McLeod. And the topic today, to give a bit of background, is really around for the year, and Asper might have already indicated this, but dissecting influences or influence critical insights into education and educational research. And I don't think there's been another time in history where there's been, I think, research is so important with regards to, well, influencing education and its research. And it is, if we look at, for instance, what's happening across the country, from core content to extreme compliance and auditing like we've probably never seen before, or I certainly have never seen that. And when we think about that, what does the research say in that regard? Now, our speakers today, firstly, I'm going to start with you, Julie, if that's okay. Julie's a professor of curriculum and equity and social change at the University of Melbourne, where she was previously the Pro Vice Chancellor, Research Capability. Julie is an absolute powerhouse, and I think we're very honoured today to have Julie speaking with us. She was the president of the Australian Association for Research in Education from 23 to 2025, co-editor of History of Education Review, and currently the president of the Australian and New Zealand History and Education Society, and elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and with Jill in leading some, I think, what is some of the most important work in education research with the decanal, I think it is, or decade plan for the next 10 years, which will be a first in educational research, and certainly borrowing from the likes of the sciences, where they've done very well in terms of clearly articulating what their priorities are, and we need to, well, I think, follow suit in education, but in our own way. Jill Blackmore, AM, is a distinguished professor at Deakin in education and the Faculty of Arts and Education. She's the former president of the Australian Association of University Professors, as well as the Australian Association of Educational Research. She undertakes research from a feminist perspective of educational policy and governance, school autonomy reform, gender equity reform, leadership, organisational change,
You can stop now, Amy. Thank you.
keep going and going. She also has current projects in with the ARC linkage, and a number of many other accomplishments that we could sit here and I could describe for the entire time. But I think what we can both agree, or what we can all agree, is that we have two very distinguished educational researchers, absolute powerhouses. And I've said enough. Over to you both.
Thanks so much. How we're going to organise it, everybody, is I'll speak for the first 7 or 8 slides, and then Julie's going to take over, because otherwise it gets a bit too complicated. But Julie's the one with the hand on the button, literally. So thank you very much for that, Amy, and thank you, Aspra, for that introduction. And we're very appreciative that we're the first in the keynote lecture series, and we like the notion of issues around influence, which we are hoping to do. Okay, we also want to make acknowledgement of country, and in the spirit of reconciliation and truth-telling, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea and community in this country. And of course, sovereignty has never been ceded. And we, Julie and I, are both located, even though we're in different rooms and spaces, we are both on the Wurundjeri peoples, on the land of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. And we also pay respects to their elders past, present and emergent. And I think just as in this distributive form that we are currently, it's very nice to take a moment to think about the ancestry of the land upon which each of us are now located. Thanks. Okay, and that's a bit of Fitzroy art, that bit on the... Anyway, right, so planning for the future of education research. These are the steps that we're going to go through. We're going to explain why is a Decadal Plan is important, the background to how it came to be, the process and purpose of the plan, and why we're developing it, the themes that we've already found from roundtables informing the consultation, additional themes that have emerged after the consultation, and then the current state of the draft of the plan, and this is necessarily a draft, and then the next steps that we're going to carry out. And at the end of it, we'd really like you to ask some questions, because we see this as part of our consultative process, and hopefully we'll finish with about 15, 20 minutes. Thanks, Julie. Okay, so what's the warrant for this plan? Well, we've got numerous and large challenges facing education. It's a critical moment for education and education research. Of course, we've got the shifting geopolitics leading to uncertainty and national concerns over self-reliance and defence. We've got democracies under threat, misinformation, disinformation, foreign intervention in universities and government. We've got climate change and issues of sustainability. We've got the growing polarisation of society, economic, political and cultural. There was another point that was meant to be in there that was about disrupting the Gen AI factors for education research and also governance, as well as the imperative to properly address First Nations priorities, including how we address the ongoing impact of colonialism and its legacies today. Thanks, Julie. Okay, so the education's purposes and possibilities. What we argue and are going to be arguing very strongly is that education underpins all dimensions of social and economic life, and it's vital to how well equipped we are to navigate the future and address current challenges, that education can be transformative to individuals, families and communities, creating conditions for people to flourish, that education is critical for an inclusive, just and democratic civil society and sustainable planet, and that education is a national good, driving workforce participation. Now, whilst we might see these as unquestionable issues, the main issue that we have finally addressing in this particular idea about where the plan came from was that education in Australia is a well-established field of research with deep roots and valuable expertise that informs education policy and practice, and yet we still do not have that capacity to impact policy, and we do not have that visibility that we feel is so important. So we're looking and arguing here in the case of education for a new social contract for education research, and here we're drawing on the UNESCO's notion that making the similar points that we've just done around we're at a critical turning point, and it requires this new social contract for education and for education research in the future. And this agenda must, to quote, conserve itself centrally with the right to education, interrogating all barriers to quality, equitable education for all. And so these principles and the imperative for change motivates this Decadal Plan to strengthen, sustain and invest in education research, and it requires, we argue, cross-sectoral collaboration and enabling infrastructure to facilitate new ways of collaborating to realise, okay, that's okay, you can move on, to realise progress towards. So, okay. She's trying to tell me to hurry up, obviously. Right, actually, it's all right. Background. Okay, so where did this come from? Well, back in 2023, There was a meeting of education research leaders called in Adelaide, basically through Cadre and AARE. Cadre is the education research leaders underpinning the Australian Council of Deans of Education. And the main three reasons for this was that we felt there was a disconnect between education research and policy, that the status of education research as a field within the university sector was not respected in the way we expected. And we thought there was a lack of funding. It was one of our worst years, I think, in ARC funding coming through in that year. So I'd been asked to bring, just to do a quick presentation on the role of the Academy of Social Sciences, and also in my role as the President of the Australian Association of University Professors. And I went and talked to the people in the Academy and met with Chris Hatherley, who's the CEO, Dr. Chris Hatherley. He's the CEO of the Academy of Social Sciences, and he made a number of suggestions about possible pathways we could take, doing workshops, and we did actually do a workshop on the Anthropocene. And then he also talked about this notion of a Decadal Plan that he'd already undertaken with the Academy of Science and got quite successful impact with politicians and also funding. So that, of course, attracted our attention. So the initiative went on between the Academy and AARE executive. And at this point, Julie was getting in charge of that. So this is where we headed off. The priorities, we held at Deakin a round table. We actually had 29 peak education research organisations across every sector: early childhood, schools, voc ed, higher ed, and researchers at different career stages and areas of specialisation. And out of that, we developed a communique, which was signed off with this plan to collaborate and undertake sector-wide consultation to produce a plan. Okay, so what the initial priorities were that came out of that roundtable were justice, quality and equity for all. And this is about getting avenues for more coordinated cross-sectoral and cross-disciplinary research to identify solutions that deliver outcomes for all learners. The second major issue was a prepared and well-supported education workforce. And here we're looking across every sector here, early childhood right through to voc ed, higher and school ed. The role here is that education research can play in building evidence and insight for teaching and learning, the workforce needs and improving workplace conditions. We know that that latter point is very important. A world-class connected research capability. This is about gaining investment in models and activities that enable better access and connections across research data sets. We know there's a huge amount of data we find very difficult to access, to coordinate, to analyse. And coupled with that is rigorous research training that supports a strong connected research capability. And finally, cross-sector collaboration and shared understanding and knowledge. And this is about getting avenues for collaboration and shared learning that supports alignment in terms of career-long learning and greater mobility. So, Julie, I think this is where I pass over to you, because this is where Julie then came in as chair of the steering group that we formed for this particular plan.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. And thanks also for the invitation. So I'm going to go through some of the developments and ideas since those days that were really, AARE was very important under the leadership of the former executive and with Jill and other senior leaders in really bringing this problem into a more solvable form, if you like, because I think many of us had been able to critique and express concern about how can education and all the breadth and depth of education research that happens across the country, how can that, one, be just better recognised, both by funders and in the policy realm. So I think there's been quite a huge amount of development there. So this notion of a decadal plan, it's not the most felicitous phrase, but thought possibly best to try to describe it a little bit. When I'm thinking about it, I think it's sort of like a 10-year strategic roadmap for educational research. Now, I won't read through all the statements there. You can look at those. So it has the vision. It involves collaboration across sector. And I think that's a key element of it. It is both a mechanism for collaboration, and the consultation helps build that collaboration. It maps out some priorities and we're in the middle of doing that now, like trying to make concrete the ambitions and all the fine aspirations and terrifically valuable feedback, and then implementation. Now, the last two are actually kind of tricky in this space because of the status of a decadal plan, right? So it is, you might say, it gives a public face, a common profile to a very diverse field, not only diverse in sectors, but diverse in the types of organisations that do research, the sub-disciplines that build up, that characterise educational research, and the type of research that is done. And in a really positive and healthy way, we're all going to disagree on lots of really fundamental things. So in trying to emphasise coming to common ground, as it were, it's less about silencing dissent and not using dissent to silence the impact of educational research. Right? So we really are trying to work with this document and this plan through sort of persuasion. You know, how can we make this plan something that governments will listen to, funding agencies, your own faculties? We had, as part of the consultation, a couple of deans and heads of school said that they were already leaning on some of the emergent findings to guide some of their strategic thinking. So it's at that level of aspiration. And so the notion of accountability is something we want to return to, and how we can make it a doable plan that doesn't just sit on the shelf with these very nice headings. If you're wanting to see what a finished one could look like, there are, as Amy was saying, and Jill, the science disciplines have been very effective in this domain. The Academy has recently supported one looking at social science research infrastructure, and you can look at that on the Academy website, which again is something very directly relevant to educational research, particularly around data access, the type of research infrastructure that humanities, arts and social sciences need. Now, so how did we go about this? So some of you in the room, I know, and it's great to see some familiar faces, are aware of how we went about this, but it has been a very intense and intensive 6 months, beginning at the 2025 AARE conference in University of Newcastle, where we sort of launched a consultation document, a sort of series of a bit of a sector snapshot of where we were, but largely positioned as a set of provocations to invite feedback. And as you know, with every document that goes back, you get always very helpful, mostly helpful feedback on how it could be different, and that's great, right? So, and we've taken that on board. We have met had 10 online and then 4 in-person roundtables, and many written, incredibly thoughtful submissions. It's actually been amazing to really take on board and read those, where people have taken very seriously and sincerely the invitation to respond. And so I think that really augurs well for the collaboration and the goodwill across the sectors. So we've been the last month or so with our colleagues in the Academy digesting that feedback, and then trying to knock that into shape, if you like. What do we do with that? What's common feedback? What might be outlier feedback? What's actionable in terms of this document? As you will see, we spoke to individual researchers, deans, associate deans research, community orgs, departments of ed, and state governments and Commonwealth, professional associations, organisations such as the Australian Institute for Family Studies, and just being reminded of all the many different organisations and agencies that conduct research that is either directly in line with or very adjacent to our concerns. So it's been very powerful learning, actually. So as part of managing that and overseeing that consultation so that Jill and I just don't roam free, we
Why not?
imagine the thought. Then we have a steering committee which comprises members of organisations who have made financial contributions. Now, it's not simply pay to play. Not the only people, you didn't only have to be able to afford to pay. Some organisations paid very modest amount, and others such as Deans of Education, ACDE and Australian Council of Education and Research were able to contribute more to employ interns, graduate researchers, early career researchers, to support the management and the coordination of the consultation process and the initial writing. We also had co-opted members to ensure sufficient, appropriate representation. And we've been meeting on a 6-weekly basis, sort of checking in, sense checking, and we're now at a bit at the sort of crunchy pointy end where we're going through the structure of the plan and inviting experts in the area of relevant areas, so experts in vocational education, to sense check things. So it's really moving apace. Now, these are just an indication, as some of you were in the rooms when we were having these discussions, but these are some of the sort of broad questions that we were raising. And it'd be really interesting to get a sense from people in this room too. This question of, what do we want the education research sector to look like in 3, 5, or 10 years? Now, speaking candidly and critiquing myself, I'm probably more expert at saying what's wrong with it than perhaps envisaging how else it might be. And I think this gives us a really strong opportunity to articulate those visions. And I think that's a really important thing for us all to be doing as educational researchers interested in policy critique as well as making policy and initiatives. So some of them are moving from that, big picture thinking to how we work out what the immediate priorities are, putting some immediate priorities and goals in place, but being attuned to the social fact that over 10 years, the context in which education research happens is going to change dramatically. And how do we have a plan that's able to be responsive to that? Of big concern to us and across all the consultation is the enablers in any level for educational research. What do we need in place to promote high quality, diverse, responsive, exploratory educational research? What do we need once we've identified those goals? What do we need to be able to implement and, sorry about the word, operationalize the plan? We're going to get back to, governance towards the end of this. But so these are the sort of, we're going from big picture thinking into the nuts and bolts of how we might put to work such a plan, a strategic roadmap. Yes. Now, again, big vision thinking, this ideal state it's connected, well-resourced, and a high-impact sector that delivers on needs and aspirations across the educational life course. Now, for me, the second sentence is a pretty important one, and I think Jill and I have been, it's a kind of constant backwards and forwards across all the consultation. It's getting that balance between research that drives new knowledge, exploratory discovery research, maintaining that, nourishing that, and provides innovative and effective responses to more immediate policy and practice challenges. So we would want to keep both, and there are many other dimensions, but to keep those centre as well. So some high-level synthesis of key findings that came out of the plan. This idea of reasserting the high benefit in much the same way. We might we don't question the value of health research, but the high benefit of education as a national and social good with these significant democratic health, well-being and economic benefits. There was unanimous support for these sort of following dot points around being better able and more confidently and cutting through kind of communication on the contributions of education research, and how to align, embed education research within existing policy priorities. And so going back to the focus of the Dean series, a core challenge is, how do we position ourselves to be more influential collectively, in small groups and individually and organisationally? And again, core principles and commitments. Now, there was quite a lot of feedback after the initial consultation document. I think it's a really valuable set of discussions about what are the principles here. You can have enablers and plans and goals and whatever, but what are the underlying principles that might motivate education research? And many of the submissions and the workshops from First Nations researchers, as well as non-Indigenous researchers advocating for this, was a principle about First Nations first. And one of the sort of provocations or set of questions that emerged from that was these fundamental questions about whose problem is that we are actually trying to address, and that to think about how positioning First Nations first in such a way as sector-wide principles will inform research and enrich research with all equity groups, okay, that ask about purposes, problem definition, analysis and collection of data, and benefits. What are the benefits of the research? Now, in IDS, there is Indigenous data sovereignty, and the CARE is collaboration, I've forgotten the A, sorry, respect and engagement principles, which are about positioning how Indigenous data and other forms of data should be engaged with, and presenting that as one of the non-negotiable foundations to ethical, engaged and research, not a procedural add-on you do after. Now, the core themes that emerged in that way back in 2024 in that initial roundtable have come through in a kind of affirmed and slightly more elaborated way as we write up the plan. So one of the key priority areas was justice, equity, and high quality education for all. Of course, it's hard to disagree with that. And so it's really about what that looks like, okay, what's involved in doing that. Again, that point that an ethical, inclusive education research system that is good for First Nations communities and researchers is a system that is good for all. And in outlining that and in making the case for that, of known issues around injustice and inequity was the need to be constantly alert to emerging challenges to equity. And they are the things that are going to be more challenging over the coming decade. And we're already since, I mean, it's quite remarkable since the roundtable back in August 24, where we didn't really mention AI. And now it's almost impossible to have any discussion about education without that entering into the field. So how do we become alert and open to both emerging and ones we don't even yet imagine? There was and remains a priority item agenda for education, priority research agenda on the education and research workforce. There's across, this was from early childhood, schooling, vocational education and higher education, some very shared concerns about from well-being, deprofessionalising, credential, the sorts of qualifications and credentials that were necessary for that, precarious employment, and within the higher education sector, the growth of education specialist roles and the impact that has on individual academics, but also on research capability. In the vocational education area, recognition of the important work that is undertaken there, some of the natures of those contracts. So there's a cluster of work affecting the education and research workforce that needs both further research and sort of action on, and that is one area where I think there's very strong common ground. I've joined two together here, but they were cross-sector collaboration, and because they are connected, and research workforce capability. A lot of the discussions in the feedback on a connected education research capability was around access to data sets. Not only, but that was a recurring issue. Rather than sort of reinventing the wheel or people going off and doing small bits and pieces, that there's a huge amount of material and data already available, and how can we improve access to that? Now, this is also a particular issue for people outside higher education, right? Many people are doing educational research. Not everybody has, for example, access to the library and reference materials that universities have. But there are other ways in which cross-sector collaboration was important. And again, it's finding those issues where there is common ground. And this is connected to how everything from funding and institutional arrangements that allow us to have a more joined up approach to research. Now, again, this I think can be a bit tricky to balance, recognizing the distinctiveness of different research areas and research fields, not wanting to do away with that, but really seeing where we can find these points for slightly more joined up areas. And the three opportunities identified were particularly around that relationship between research and policy and research in practice, funding infrastructure, and recognizing the diversity of research across a range of education contexts, including for things like community education. Now, when we went out and we were talking with the feedback that has come back after our initial kind of consultation document, and this came through both in the online and in person and in the written submissions, is that how do we authentically and properly give priority? How do we recognise First Nations priorities and decolonisation of curriculum? What are the principles? What's driving that? Now, as we know, education research is a very multiple points of view, politics, values. But are there some underlying principles that's going to drive this plan? Not for all educational research, but for the plan. Increasingly AI and the implications for how research is done. Well-being, we realised as we look back that had not come up so strongly in the initial work, but was really a strong theme in all the consultations. How different types of research methods, particularly as they relate to this next point on evidence, respect for and understanding of the very many different methods that make up education research, better understanding of what counts as good, trustworthy, reliable evidence, how different types of evidence is deployed and weighted, identification of areas, and this is a more sort of workforce diagnosis, but where are the gaps in capability in our current workforce and in our future workforce? One area, and I think it's a fundamental one, we have some great experts, saying we don't, but we have relatively limited capability around in education and economics. How are we going to grow that field? The mixed economy of public and private providers, particularly in the voc ed and training area and in early education. So sort of how we work with that sector. And obviously the more immediate one are the imminent creation of the Learning and Teaching Commission and the role of other organisations such as Aero and how research is communicated into the public sphere as well as political. Now, I'm going to wind up very, very quickly. Now, visibility, impact, and risks. What we mean here is this is, some of the challenges we face as educational researchers and also trying to conceive of and bring together such a plan. We know that there are these many people will complain about siloed programs of work, and rightly so. You might say the Decadal Plan is an attempt to respond to that. We have huge risks for the education research pipeline, generational transfer, generational succession, the changing structure of the academic workforce, where being a TNR academic is increasingly going to be a minority category, right? So where is the research pipeline coming from? limited resourcing, inadequate resourcing for translation engagement, despite it being a repetitive, it's a kind of priority for almost every institution. These barriers at policy and practice level, including, and I think this is going back to that earlier point, we continue to need to have investment in discovery research. Translation doesn't come from nowhere. You've got to have something to translate. Difficulties gaining data access, the disruptive impact of Gen I, obviously, and in some states and possibly, I think many states, if not most states and territories now, protracted ethics processes that prevent timely research in different educational settings, inhibiting our opportunities to get real-time insight. Rivalrous and competitive research cultures across universities, and need for strong messaging, which is sort of what we're trying to do, about where we have these shared goals so that we cannot be dismissed as a polarized community and nobody can agree. Okay, so we're bringing it all together, and that's pretty straightforward. And we are currently working through early stage drafting of the structure of the plan, and we're in the process of working with experts on particular areas, such as I said, early childhood and vocational education, to review the goals. Still on track to launch in Canberra in the last sitting of Parliament, aspiration, November 23rd, week off. And once that launches, we'll be holding a series of implementation workshops across the country. All right, I'll finish there. And thank you, and take Q&A.
Thank you. That was terrific, and some really pertinent questions from what counts as good, trustworthy evidence to who does it benefit, what does it benefit. Aero seems like a bit of an elephant in the room, if I might be a bit cheeky.
No go.
No, go for it.
And that was something that certainly occurred to me, and for what end in that regard. So I don't know if you want to respond to that first, or we open it up to some specific questions.
Sure. I mean, you go, Jill.
Oh, well, we did invite Aero in that August 2024, and Jenny Donovan did come. And then at that point, we had invited people to contribute to put some money into developing the plan, right? And so various organisations did that, which Aero was not one of them. And later on, we had some discussion because they then wanted to be on the steering committee, and we said, well, you didn't take the opportunity. So there's a bit of a debate around that. So
they have a number of participants.
That was my next point. They have attended the AAOE meetings. They've attended the various consultations. So they have been a presence right across the various consultation. We did invite them for specific consultation as well, if they so wished. Yes, so that has happened, but they are just a lingering shadow in the elephant in the room that's ongoing, yes, is how I describe it. But they can't say we have not tried to bring them into the room.
And thank you for that. That's really interesting. Well, let's open it up to the whole floor. So please just pop your hand up, or if you're brave, of course, jump in and ask a question.
I mean, can I just put a really straightforward question? Because we are interested thinking about the framing question, Amy, about influence. And, any advice or observations people in the room have from their own experience in the workplace about how to make such documents have influence, what do they think is going to be most useful to bring it alive? Yeah.
How would you use this? We ask you as a dean, as a lecturer, as someone else, anyone in the room now. How would you use
Amanda's got a question in the chat.
It's probably very related to what you were saying just as I was typing it, but what's the plan for the plan, I guess? Like you introduce it to Parliament and then what? Like, cool, great, that's
you. So, how would you use it? How would you use it?
So on that, what we are doing is partly what we're setting up now, and it's why it goes to questions of governance and how it is being supported through those partner groups, Deans of Ed, AARE, and we would be looking to we need to have ongoing discussions with AARE this, but the annual stock take reports through, say, coinciding with AARE, annual reports back to say this is what's happening on the broader landscape. It's not as if a plan like this can go to deans and ADRs and say haven't met your KPIs, right? Right. So it's a very different way of thinking about how you make change.
It's about persuasion, us persuading you to commit to something here, and then for you to mobilise it. Basically, we want you to mobilise it, respond back to it, and so these regular types of meetings, say annually, or other things where things can be planned, other actions, so that we can. I mean, the big issue is about the temporality of it all. How do we know if something's happening? How do we take account of that in terms of accountability over, say, a 3, 5 year, 10-year?
And just like on a concrete example
we're dealing with,
in terms of research funding, for example, is a more straightforward one. There are national research priorities, right? And which you often have to say how your work aligns. Now, these are not currently going to have the status of government national priorities. They may, but in terms of showing alignment with things that are important for the field of educational research, it sort of provides some warrant or rationale for that. It provides a public face, a profile for consultation, tries to sort of authorise and give legitimacy to engaging with decision makers. It also, I would hope, in a more a kind of intangible way, provokes questions about the value of educational research and keeps that centre stage. Zoe, is that right? Regarding what counts as evidence, will mixed method need to be forefront because of what have you been saying about?
Jill, I don't think it's going to be either or in that instance. I think it's going to be all methods. It depends on the questions that you're dealing with always, doesn't it? It always goes back to that. But yeah. But I think certainly we're wanting to develop a capacity for multiple people, not just people within universities, to be able to do analysis of these available databases and things like that. That's the infrastructure question as well, too. I mean, what types of skills do we need to be able to deal with that type of data?
Yeah. And it was a big theme coming up across the consultations about a kind of unfortunate narrowing of what counted as evidence. And so not a shying away from evidence, but an insistence on, the quality of the evidence, if you like, and the sort of methods involved in that.
And then something that comes across my desk a lot as a dean, and I'm sure all deans of education, since ERA has no longer continued, and we do have the responsibility as a discipline to show that we're working at world standard or above world standard, and one of the common metrics that is being used is the field weighted citation indice, either for the researcher themselves or the piece of work. And did that come up much in terms of metrics and measures and, what is this kind of world-class research? Did that factor in at all?
Not much at all, I think, and not a lot, not as much as you would expect, I think. Although we were conscious that a new version could arise at any moment, but it didn't come up at all. I mean, people were more concerned about the competitive relationships as a barrier to collaboration, and indeed, most people felt that the metrics and the audit era has actually led to that silo and that whole competitive relationship. And so therefore it was not something that one wanted to go through. But I mean, in terms of metrics, is that, I don't know whether, is that a measure that we would want to use in terms of the field of research, education research, or not? And, you know, these are the types of issues. How do we know that something has happened, you know, in terms of working out something, you know, if there's it's like a subset, a type of a name. How do we say that this is something has happened? And, you know, what are the types of measures we would want to use? Are there other mechanisms or indicators that we'd want to use, you know?
I think that's a really interesting question. And what Jill was saying, it didn't come up. In part, it was more sort of strategically focused and sector rather than on the individual. However, I do think the broader question is that, you know, I mean, will we need in the future to defend
the field,
the integrity of the peer review system?
Yeah.
However, now we have field-wide, say, you know, we indexes at the wazoo, whatever. So, but the underlying question is, academic peer review has been the traditional measure of research quality and innovation. Is that a safe and secure? Is that going to be the case going forward? The other one is the scope of metrics. If you, for example, in the EU, going for European grants, you cannot use those metrics around impact to demonstrate quality. All right, so you have to have more qualitative indicators. Now, we're a long way from that in Australia, but it's not. These sorts of debates are happening around research governance. And I think these are things which we probably do need to be a bit more alert to. So thanks, Amy. It's a really good question.
A good question. Yeah, it's raised a very good question.
Yeah, I guess and we'll go to the questions in the chat in a moment. I was on the 2018 ERA rec panel, and while I can't talk about the specifics of it, what I can say is what I observed is that the peer review process, I think it served particular universities well, but it served other universities not well at all, because it became more about the person and less about the research in some instances. And if you looked at metrics, the metrics actually would produce better results for education.
Sort of fairer, you think?
Yeah, yes. And not only fairer, but overall, they're much higher. That we in education, we kind of almost eat our own young in terms of we're pretty harsh.
On reviews, I know we've said this multiple times, Amy. Can't stop it for some reason.
I suppose there's also journal review. You know, it's that peer review as well as grant review. Yeah.
And the peer, and I wholeheartedly believe in that. But at the ERA level, I think metrics would, if that does come back, would serve us well. Would put a better step forward, because we do quite well overall when we look at other countries, but you wouldn't think that necessarily from then the ERA results.
Oh no, we outperform on metrics, I think. Yeah.
So one optimistic view could be that, you know, a decadal plan could provide a kind of more, you know, a platform to make these sorts of arguments.
Exactly.
I'm just conscious as well of questions in the chat.
Yeah, so we've got Tanya's got a comment here around small scale studies of the problem in education rather than the methodological approach.
Yep.
And this is why this project can be successful in firstly doing the meta-analysis across small studies, and secondly setting a national set of priorities.
Yep. Thanks, Tanya. That's
a good point. Yeah. And also, I think there was a consensus that for some of the major issues, and this is across all the consultations and face-to-face and whatever, was the need for us to work more collaboratively across the university sector on big issues. In other words, you know, really get a concentration of researchers in the same space rather than just one university, you know, doing that and putting one bid in, but really thinking. And I think when we think about what might be happening with the new ARC rules coming in, that was very strong, that came across that these bigger projects with larger teams across multiple universities. And I think that was something that came through also quite clearly in all of the discussions. Again, there seemed to be a strong drive for consensus and concentrations like this because we know the field is always under constantly being told, you don't know what you're doing, yours, whatever. So I just think that was quite a really positive aspect of it all. A willingness to collaborate. Yes, is how I describe it.
And there's a question here for you, Jill. It says, "Dear Jill, thank you for your thought-provoking papers I've read over the years. I wonder if ideas from our First Nations can have a greater influence, for example, the anti-colonial mindset."
Wow. Okay. Right. That's an interesting one. Well, I think as we said, we've come out of this, and I think First Nations first is the basic principle upon which we're going to be driving this plan, and I think that does require us to take into account the impact of colonialism across any of our studies, any of the field of education, which of course has been systemically racist and structural racism as well. And I think we have to take that into account, and I think. But that is going to take a concerted effort of us working, with our First Nations peoples in co-designs of projects and programs, and I think that's very, very important. So a good and challenging question, and I think yes, and influence is interesting with your discussion about influence. I have to say, I have written a paper around the closed circuit of influence, which is talking about error and other things. So I'll send it off to you, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love that. And Asper, given that you provoked that question, it's made me think about it. So I'll pass it around.
I like
just a research report doing a critique of Aero, basically, and a few other think tanks.
It's interesting. And we've got another question here from Lisa, and this might be the one we end on. It says, "In this neoliberal capitalist world, educational researchers won't really survive without our customers, in brackets, teachers. Yet it feels like teachers are not able to, don't have time to, and maybe are not interested in prioritizing delving into research to inform their practice. More thoughts about how these customers are going to be reached over the next decade?"
Yes. Yes. I mean, action research was something always one thinks about, but as you said, there's no time, no effort, and departments of education are really closing down that type of activity. So the question is how we can engage even with departments of education better to try and reopen the door for teachers as researchers type of thing. I I understand it's the work conditions, and the unions in Victoria and elsewhere are fighting that issue now. But it does rely very heavily on a capacity now for us to try and reopen that door with talking to ministers of education and others, the policymakers. Yeah.
I agree with that, Jill, because teachers every day are doing cutting edge stuff that we necessarily don't see in the research world, and it's bridging that gap.
But that's another form of evidence that is totally neglected, with top-down evidence being imposed on notions, small, very narrow bases of evidence being imposed on them, rather than recognising that teachers develop and produce evidence constantly in everything they do.
Amy, could I just make a small response to the last question, and then
Sure.
Thanks, Sheridan. Customers are also policymakers and politicians. How will this plan help reach and influence them? I think that was one of our core motivations to start with, and partly it is about making it more not straight, kind of that the plan could represent, and the groups associated with, a go-to group, that we would want to use it as a platform to meet and get access into to decision makers and parliamentarians. And we've been doing some of that as part of the consultation process, and there is quite a lot of interest in it, and trying to move beyond the nobody agrees, well, yes, no, to education researchers can enrich your policy making. So that is a really core focus are one of the audiences, stakeholders for this work. Yeah. Doing it is not as easy as that little sentence made it sound, but yes.
Yeah. But also philanthropists and industry are also other key people we're trying to focus with as well.
Yeah.
And certainly a strategy that I've been applying and with the 2 current ARCs I'm leading at the moment, the end point of them is about co-designing frameworks with children, young people. So you're almost saying, here, I've done it for you, in order to have frameworks that can lead into policy and so forth. And I'm seeing more and more of that, which is very heartening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So on that note, I would like to thank you both, Jill and Julie, for a very thought-provoking keynote today. It's fabulous, and thank you for allowing us to be part of it. Thank you, Asper, for also driving it, and thank you to Marion and Siobhan for doing all the organisation as well. Great to see you all.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you.
And for coming along.
Yes, and for coming along. Yes. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks, Jill.
See you.
Bye. Bye.